All right, everyone, welcome to the February Angler Survey Committee webinar. Got three great talks lined up. Lyndsie Wszola is going to talk about some of the work she's done with the Cat project and looking at how climate change might affect recreational angling in the future. Right after that, we've got two talks from the Venturelli Lab at Ball State, looking at self-reporting fishing app data and using that to track fish assemblages. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lyndsie and let her get started.
All right. Thanks very much, Dave. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining me. I am going to be talking about work that I did as part of my postdoc at the University of Missouri. So if you've been working in this space long enough, or even if you're an angler who's been on the water for enough years, you're probably aware that inland lakes are warming. And one of the things that shocked me when I first got into this work was just how much and how fast that warming is happening. So this map here shows individual lakes in the Midwest and southern US as points, and then the color of the point is going to indicate the current temperature of the lake. And the temperature unit that we're using here is growing degree days, which is a sort of an integrated measure of temperature across the year. And what we see is that right now we've got a very clear latitudinal gradient. Our northern glacial lakes up in northern Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin tend to be quite cool, down more in the 2,500 to 2,700 range. Whereas down where I live in Missouri, it's quite warm, almost 9,000 growing degree days per year. And what we see is that as the century progresses, we're going to expect that that red starts to creep further and further north until by the end of the century, we expect that a lot of the lakes in the southern part of the Great Lakes range, the inland lakes in the southern part of the Great Lakes region, are going to look more like some of the lakes down where I live look today. These data, by the way, are from this really fantastic large lake temperature model. Totally recommend checking out if you do any kind of works with lake temperature and climate in the Midwest. So what are the consequences of large-scale warming for fish and fisheries? If you've ever taken a fish physiology class, you might have heard temperature referred to as the ecological master factor. And the reason for that is that fish are ectotherms. So all the processes happening in their bodies are happening at paces determined by the temperature of their environment. So when we raise the temperature, we also speed up their need for food. We speed up their respiration, potentially their growth, and usually their mortality. So when we do that to a large number of organisms across a broad range of space, it has some consequences that I think we're just starting to grapple with. We also know that climate change has consequences for anglers independent of its consequences for fish. One of the most distressing papers I've ever read in my career as a scientist is this one here from 2020, demonstrating that winter drowning deaths have increased in regions that traditionally have ice travel seasons. So these are places where people traditionally use snowmobiles or walk or skate on the ice in the wintertime. And that's happening because overall warmer winters coupled with increasingly erratic temperatures during the winter are leading to less stable ice. So we also see this in places where we just have open water fishing seasons. If your summer temperatures are rising into the 30s or into the 90s for us US folks, that's going to make it increasingly uncomfortable for you to fish and maybe even unsafe. So how do we, as fisheries managers, as researchers, as communicators with the public, adapt to this kind of large systematic change? Fundamentally, we've got three options. We can resist the change, try to stop it from happening. We can accept the change and just let it proceed, or we can direct the change and try to take some agency and manage the conditions that we are receiving in order to create outcomes that we want to see. So That sounds like a reasonably tractable thought experiment if we're just talking about one freshwater system. When we're talking about large landscapes of lakes and rivers, like many of us work with every day, the question becomes more complex. Do I resist at one place at the cost of another? How do you make that kind of calculus? I'm going to talk about a project that I worked on today that's an effort to tackle these kinds of thorny questions. So the question that we were pursuing in the work I'm going to talk about is how do climate and lake morphometry affect the thermal composition of recreational catch? That is a lot of words, so I will shorten it to just 6. This paper asks, what fish do we catch where? Now, I tackled this question, as Dave mentioned, using data from CreelCat, which is the U.S. Inland Creel and Angler Survey Catalog. CreelCat, if you haven't checked it out yet, is a fantastic resource of aggregated angler survey data from across the U.S. and its territories. It represents an untold number of hours of work for a lot of people, and getting to work with CreelCat data and the CreelCat team has been one of the great joys of my career. So if you haven't checked it out yet, absolutely encourage you to go look at the data. CreelCat covers a really wide range of states in the US. There's even more since this map was published. And we used it to build this model that's now published in Transactions. You can go read it if you like. And explore how climate change, how climate and the physical characteristics of lakes work together to affect the composition of fish that people catch during their recreational fishing trips. So we focused on a subset of lakes from the states where we have some of the best creel data. So these 3 states are Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. They are 3 of our northern Great Lakes states. If you're not super familiar with the U.S., these states are tucked up against the Canadian border, surrounded by the Great Lakes on the northern side. And these states look very much like that lake screenshot that I showed you earlier. They tend to have large networks of lakes across a climate and ecological matrix that can include both agricultural fields up to deep boreal forest. So the black points on this map are all of the different lakes that were included in the large lake climate model. And then the white points layered on top are those places where we have creel data. So this model is going to be fit using those places where we have overlapping creel and climate data. So the way this model works is that it thinks about an individual fish catch event as a test. And if that individual catch event yields a warm water fish, something like a sunfish, a catfish, or a largemouth bass, we're going to consider that a 1. And if it yields a cool water fish, something like a perch, a walleye, a lake trout, or a sturgeon, we're going to consider that a 0. So what we're predicting here is the likelihood that any given fish caught in one of these lakes will be a warm water fish. We're going to call that warm water catch share. So when we accessed all of our catch data from CreelCat, we ended up with about 11 million warm water catch records, about 4.7 million cool water catch records. That's from almost 600 lakes across our 3 states. So this model is fairly simple. It's a Bayesian hierarchical model, but at its core, it's trying to understand how warm water catch share varies in response to temperature, lake area depth, lake depth, lake shoreline development index, which is how complex of a shape the lake is. We also, to correct for the fact that ice anglers might be different in their objectives and behavior from open water anglers, included an ice covariate that reflects how much of the individual creel survey was conducted during the ice fishing season. And what we found is fairly logical. So we found that warm water catch share increased as a function of temperature and SDI. So that means that anglers were more likely to catch warm water fish where lakes were warmer and where lakes have more complex shapes. We also found that warm water catch share was negatively associated with lake area, lake depth, and survey ice coverage. So another way to say this would be anglers on smaller, warmer, more poorly and complexly shaped lakes are catching warm water fish, and anglers on larger, simply shaped, colder and deeper lakes are catching cool water fish. So when we take those temperature results together with our predicted warm water catch share results and map them back on our 3 states, what we see is that we expect a substantial increase in growing degree days from now to mid-century being 2040 to 2060. We expect to see a corresponding decrease in ice coverage, losing somewhere between 7 and 9 days of ice coverage on average. And we expect to see an increase in warm water catch share. So under our current conditions, our warm water catch share is largely concentrated around the southern part of the study area and also around urban heat islands. Toward the end of the century, we expect to see that just sort of spread out and to see a much larger portion of these states receiving ever more warm water fishing, ever more warm water fish catch events compared to cool water fish catch events. So I just threw a ton of information at you, and I told you that we were supposed to be using it to make a decision. So what do we do with this? Does this tell us to resist the change from cool water to warm water fishing opportunities, to accept it and just let it happen, or to direct it? And do things like try to acclimate anglers to new conditions, or do public outreach efforts and explain why the change is happening. What I want to encourage you to think about is that you don't have to answer this question once. We can think about it. We can think about resist, accept, direct frameworks as a general framework for guiding our responses to changes on individual lakes within regions. So in other words, I want you to focus not on those big sweeping, super smooth images I showed you, but on the idea of heterogeneity within regions. So we're going to go to one of my favorite places now and focus back on northern Minnesota. This is Cass County, Minnesota, so up near the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And I want you to think about two lakes. The first is going to be Leech Lake, which is this big lake at the top. Leech Lake, traditional, very large, quite cool system, historically great walleye fishery. Roosevelt Lake, also a good walleye fishery, but provides opportunities as well for fish like largemouth bass, is this small crescent-shaped lake down in the lower right-hand corner. So Leech Lake is about 42,000 hectares, and Little Roosevelt Lake is only about 600 hectares. Right now, they have quite similar climate conditions. They're both sitting around 3,800 growing degree days and around 130 to 140 ice days per year. But we predict that Leech's warm water catch share is only about 8%, whereas Roosevelt's is sitting at around 30%. Now, by the end of the century, we expect to see a more substantial increase in growing degree days at Roosevelt than we do at Leech. So about 100 growing degree days more. And that's simply because Roosevelt is a much smaller lake, so it's warming faster. And we see a proportionally similar predicted increase in warm water catch share. So we expect to see about a 3% increase in warm water catch share compared to about 11% at Roosevelt. Now, if you're a quantitative person and you're sitting there and saying like, oh, okay, an 8% to 11% increase versus a 30% increase to a 40% increase, those are proportional shifts. You're totally right. But I'd be willing to bet if you're an angler on the ground, that 30% to 40% shift is going to feel a lot more drastic to you than a 3% or than an 8% to an 11% shift. So what do I do with this information if I'm trying to make decisions for these systems? One way you could think about it is that lakes like Leech, where changes are likely to be slower and less drastic, might be good candidates for resist efforts. Things like stocking, things like channel modification, protecting gravel bars, trying to make sure that we hang on to that cool water habitat as much as we can. Whereas places like Roosevelt that are smaller and more complex and likely to warm faster might be places where we consider accept direct strategies. So things like education efforts for anglers to help them understand their changing fish populations. In my last couple minutes, I want to highlight one more option in this resist accept direct framework. And that's a lake that occurs in my own state in Missouri, right on the border with our neighbor Arkansas. And the reason I want to highlight this lake for a couple of reasons. One is that I genuinely really love my state's water bodies, and I talk them up whenever I get the opportunity. And the other is that it represents an engineered option in climate adaptation that I think should get more attention. So Bull Shoals is a very large lake. It's about 18,000 hectares, and it's an extremely deep lake, 62 meters. It's the last in the third of a chain of reservoirs on the White River. the White River rises in Arkansas from a series of spring-fed streams. And because Bull Shoals is the last in this chain, it's getting cold bottom water that started life as spring water, so already cold, gets impounded in Table Rock, a huge reservoir upstream, and then gets oxygenated in a small riverine reservoir in between. So even though this lake sits quite far south and it should be very warm, it's actually receiving cold oxygenated water year round through a quirk of geology and engineering. And the reason I know about this in such depth is that when I first moved down here, I started hearing about walleye in this lake, and I was just totally baffled. It's like, how do you have walleye on the border between Missouri and Arkansas? Because I'd been spending all this time working on walleye population shifts in the northern Great Lakes, which are, of course, much, much colder than southern Missouri. And it turns out that it's because of this unique engineered system. So if we look at mean epilimnion temperatures at Bull Shoals, blue is right now, yellow is mid-century, and red is end of century. And that white bar there is walleye critical thermal maximum. So the temperature at which we'd expect walleye to have a very bad time. What we see is that mean epilimnion temperature does indeed well exceed where we expect walleye to struggle. But when we break it down and look at what the actual profiles look like, over time, these are July temperatures, so mid-century warmest temperatures. And then this graph's a little funky, so we've got depth on the x-axis and temperature on the y-axis, and then same color scheme as before. What we see is that if we make the assumption that walleye can descend to the thermocline, which is that white bar there, this big engineered system has actually created a thermal refuge because of the way they handle water in the system and because of the original origin of the water. So even though we have a system that absolutely biological standards shouldn't have walleye, it's likely going to for the foreseeable future. And when I first started to dig into this and started to try and understand how there were walleye there at all and what might happen to them, I was totally blown away by this because this is not an option I had considered. So if you take one thing away from my talk, I want it to be that the path forward will likely ask us to embrace heterogeneity and look not just at our presuppositions of what a healthy fishery looks like and what we need to make it happen, but rather the full suite of conditions we encounter on the ground and the tools that we have at our disposal. So thank you, everybody, for listening to me, and be happy to take questions.
All right, we got a couple minutes for questions. Just go ahead and raise your hand if you've got any. I got a question, Lyndsie. Are uh, are you starting to look at some of the changes with Missouri data, or I'm not sure if there's Creel data that goes back that far, but trying to do some of the other analysis with fishery independent data?
That's a good question. I have not. So we're actually currently in the process of rebooting our Creel program in Missouri. So we used to have a robust Creel program, and agency priorities had shifted away from it for some time. So no, but hopefully somebody else will be able to in the future if we do our work well.
All right. Well, all right, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. I was wondering about the separation of finding that relationship between the different formations of a lake. Specifically, I was wondering about depth and shape of if there's relationship to seeing more warm water fish is related to being natural lakes over man-made lakes, or if there's, how that was isolated and see those effects independently.
Oh, that's a really good question. I did not explicitly test to see if it was due to them being natural or man-made. Are you coming at this from the angle of thinking, yeah, can you tell me how you're thinking that the shape relationship between natural and man-made lakes would play out?
Yeah, it was more of just like observation. Now, I've not looked at any specific data to see where this supported, but like, yeah, I've from other geographic work of just looking at it, man-made lakes forming in just like where the watershed is filling up based on like where a dam is placed or where some kind of impoundment is formed, versus natural lakes that might form from deeper craters that have had time to kind of bowl out, creating like oxbows and such. So I'd be curious if man-made lakes might have different effects. I was wondering just if there was any isolation or independence that you guys experimented with when finding that relationship.
So I did look at both the raw trait data and at the posteriors from the model to make sure that there was no correlations. So there was no correlations exceeding a 0.6, I think, which is the standard that we'd set for being acceptable. But no, I didn't explicitly test for lake origin, but that would be an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as a potential angle for something. I was like, just curious if y'all looked into that. So yeah, thank you.
I'm Olivia Cervantez, a first-year master's student here at Ball State University in the Venturelli lab, and we worked with some pretty awesome scientific professionals at the Danish Technical University to assess the impacts of two fisheries apps analyzing a single fishery in Denmark. So currently there's a knowledge gap in recreational fisheries, and we need an efficient way to collect this data. Traditional methods are pretty reliable, such as creel and mail surveys, but they're costly to conduct and they're limited in time and space. Currently, there's millions of users using various fishing apps, so why not use them? They're an efficient way to collect recreational fisheries data, and they recruit spatially diverse reporters. They've been used in the past to look at aquatic invasive species movements, the overall spatial distribution of users, harvest rates, and you can ask just about any question with app data. So the European Union has recognized this need for recreational fisheries data. So they've issued a mandate that will go into effect in 2026 that all member states must have an electronic reporting system for the recreational fisheries. This reporting system can be an existing app, a new app, or the country can use an app that the European Union develops. They can use multiple apps at once, and that kind of presents a potential problem because there's multiple apps that are going to be representing a single fishery. These apps are all going to be slightly different. Yes, some of the reporting requirements will be the same, but there is a risk of different apps representing this fishery in different ways, and we're still back at square one where we don't even know what truth is. But there's also an opportunity here. We can research the overall validity of this data that's collected by these fishers and how this can be used for management practices. So in response to this mandate, Denmark has two fishing apps, Fangstjournalen or FJ, which is a digital logbook that was specifically developed for research. It's a citizen science app, and users know that their data is going to be used for recreational fisheries management. This data is going to be used to assess what's going on in the fishery. We also have Fishing in Denmark, which was originally a marketing app. It was designed to give fishers information about local regulations, weather, fishing hotspots, those kinds of things. And then in 2022, they added trip and catch reporting. So now we can compare these two apps and how they're assessing the Denmark fishery. So that led us to our research questions. And we want to know if different apps recruit different users. We would suspect yes. Different apps target different user bases. which could potentially affect key fishery metrics, such as the number of trips recorded, the catches recorded, the overall spatial distribution of these users, and the species of interest. We also want to see how apps affect user reporting. So that kind of goes towards app design. How do apps interact with users, and how does this affect the overall data quality that is being gathered? So we looked at active users over time. In the black line, we have FJ. And in 2022, we see that emergence of fishing in Denmark. That's when they added that catch and trip reporting to their app. And what this is telling us is that users are willing to use, fishers, I should say, are willing to use apps to record their data. There's a high adoption of apps. We also looked at these two platforms in half-year increments. In blue, we have FJ, and in gray, we have fishing in Denmark. And overall, the number of users up until 2024 was more in fishing in Denmark. FJ then surpasses fishing in Denmark in number of users in that first half of 2024. And that's telling us that our FJ users have higher retention, which could potentially mean that they're more dedicated to reporting. Then in that graph below, we see the total number of fishing trips. So fishing in Denmark had more users, and we would suspect that that would mean more fishing trips, but that was not true. We saw that FJ had more fishing trips, even with less users. And that's telling us that FJ is either more avid anglers, they're going out there more, fishing more, or they're just better reporting. They're reporting more trips compared to fishing in Denmark. When we looked at the overall catch composition across these two apps, they're pretty similar. Those top three species are the same, and we saw that there was a similar proportion of fishing on weekends and holidays. And that's telling us that when these fishers have free time, they're going out and fishing. Fishing is of high priority to these users. When we looked at the spatial distribution of these users, when at least one trip is recorded, we have in gray both platforms, in green fishing in Denmark, and in purple FJ. And that gray is showing that these users, when at least one trip is reported, they have pretty similar spatial distribution. This is good. It allows us to compare these two apps and the data it's collecting to see if they're saying the same thing or if they're representing something differently. And it's telling us that we're capturing this fishery. When 10 or more trips is recorded, we see spatial dominance by FJ, which is in purple, and fishing in Denmark is in that green. So we know that FJ recorded more trips and that they have greater spatial diversity. One positive about having both of these apps is that they're spatially complementary. So when FJ is not covering an area, fishing in Denmark is, which allows us to capture capture more of this fishery, which helps with when we implement management practices. When we looked at the fishery metrics, that dotted line at 1 is telling us that there is no difference across these fishery metrics when we compared both apps. And black is significant and gray is not significant. So we saw that FJ recorded significantly more fishing trips, 0 trips, and more catches, and they had heavier fish, higher weight of fish, I should say. What's interesting in that graph below is that they did not have a significantly longer trip length. They actually had significantly shorter trip length when compared to fishing in Denmark. We also see that there is not a significant difference between harvest rate, catch rate, and catch length. That non-significant difference between harvest rate and catch rate is most likely attributed to FJ recording more 0 trips. So we may have gotten a little bit lucky that FJ recorded those 0 trips significantly more than fishing in Denmark. If fishing in Denmark reported around the same, we would suspect that harvest rate and catch rate would change. And so going back to some of our questions, different apps do target different audiences. And when looking at these audiences, it's going to be important for these countries to consider that. They will most likely want audiences that value fishing and have high retention rate and that they're dedicated to reporting. But we did see that they produce different results, especially when it came to spatially and the number of trips, those 0 trips. When this data is collected, validating this data is going to be key in assessing the fishery. So those traditional methods, while they are costly to conduct and time-consuming, they are reliable. So when this data is collected, it's probably going to be a good idea to compare the fisheries app data to those traditional methods. We also see that there could be a positive with this multiple app approach. We see greater spatial distribution when multiple apps are in play and more users. So more data coming in, and we are capturing more of the fishery, which will help when we implement these management practices. We're impacting more of the fishery and more people. In the future, we want to see the effect of this mandate on user reporting. So in 2026, when this EU mandate goes into play, what are we going to see? We suspect that there will be more users, and that should increase our overall data, but how is that going to affect our data quality? And it's going to be important to consider how fishers are going to approach this mandate. Are they going to be receptive of this mandate and use these apps consistently? We also want to look at the impacts of app design. So poor app design is going to equate to lower retention, less use of the app, more knowledge gaps in the app, and it's going to be difficult to compare this data. Another thing that countries and the EU are going to need to consider is how they're going to compile this data. In our study, we had one data frame where all of our data was compiled, and so we were able to pull from that and do our analysis. And countries, if they have multiple systems in place, and the EU is going to also have to consider if they want one data frame to help streamline the process of comparing the fisheries. Thank you for holding this webinar, and I will take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks for presenting. Curious with that 2026 mandate, if Denmark is leaning towards one way or the other with the app that they're going with, and why they might be leaning one way or the other?
I'm not 100% sure if they're necessarily leaning one way or the other, but if we're just looking at it, we see that FJ had that higher retention and more trips being recorded, along with those 0 trips, which is going to be important for harvest rates and stock assessments. And so that's just kind of some aspects of an app that countries should consider. But that multiple app approach did give us more data, so 2 apps isn't necessarily a bad thing.
All right. Well, we still got some time. If anybody has any questions, they can go ahead and raise their hand. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for presenting. Really appreciate help participating in this webinar, and